I think it was The Wolf of Wall Street that did this, but here's my best version. Imagine if I sold you this pen. This pen was worth $1,000. And then somebody came up with a lid for the pen that was kind of like the pen, but then people went, oh, I don't need the pen anymore. I'm going to go do something else. That's taxis and Uber. The problem is that the people who paid for the taxi licences, well, they didn't pay private companies, they paid the government for the chance to have a taxi plate. And sure, there are big taxi companies, but there are also small business people who went all in. They borrowed $100,000, $150,000 to get a taxi plate, and then a new technology was approved that essentially you didn't need a licence for. It meant you had one person who was paying off a loan to take people while they were drunk home from parties, and another person didn't. So a system was put in place in New South Wales to try to compensate the people who had paid for the licences to become taxi drivers, but it seems like not all of the money that has been raised has actually been handed back as compensation. That's why we talked to the Labor leader in New South Wales, Chris Minns.
Yeah, so several years ago, the New South Wales government, as they introduced Uber and other ride-sharing platforms into New South Wales, gave a $20,000 payment to everybody that had a taxi licence plate in New South Wales. But the $20,000, many of them were worth over $400,000, and on top of the paltry amount of money that was given to them, it was taxed by the federal government, so they ended up with just $11,000 in their hands, and these people are really going out the door backwards. They need a lot of help from the New South Wales government, and basically they've heard crickets for the last 4 years.
How is it that this proposal can come from a Liberal Party that purports to represent small business? How is the government justifying this?
Look, they're not justifying it. I mean, effectively, they haven't returned the taxi industry's phone calls for years and years, not months and months, years and years. And to add insult to injury, they created a fund. So every fare in New South Wales has a $1 surcharge. That money has all been collected, and $100 million of it is still sitting in the government coffers because the people who've applied for hardship funds have been rejected. So on top of the paltry amount of money that they've received from the New South Wales government, hardship money hasn't even gone out the door. So it's a really terrible situation in this state. We need to do something about it. The 5,000 taxi plate owners shouldn't be blamed for being put in this position.
The head of the taxi industry has said that this will be the death of the industry. Do you agree?
Yeah, Ray Hadley's pointed this out many times over the last couple of years, but the New South Wales government's got to start listening, because at the end of the day, these people, I mean, a lot of these taxi licences exist because people came back after the Second World War. They were given a taxi licence, they worked in that industry. It's better to think of them as small business people. They've handed it over to future generations of people so that they can add value, and it's an asset or a piece of capital that those families have owned. And basically, they're not worth a lot of money anymore. So the New South Wales government needs to sit down with the industry, start negotiating with them sensibly, and we need a fair arrangement here because people have been left out of pocket. And many people tell me if they put that money, that original capital, in the property market or in shares, they would have been far, far better off than they are at the moment.
And Chris, what are you hearing from taxi drivers on the ground? They were promised compensation. Does this get raised in Parliament very much?
Yeah, every single member of Parliament has been inundated with taxi plate owners. I'm a member for Cogra, my electorate's in St George. Traditionally, we've had heaps of taxi plate licence holders and drivers in the St George region. And they say the same things over and over again. Look, if we put the money into the property market like my brother did, or we put it into shares like my sister did, they all seem to be doing well. Our investment's gone from, say, $400,000 to virtually nothing. You don't get much in the transfer market when it comes to taxi plates. They were promised compensation. They were promised by the government that they'd be listened to.